Hello, this is Mugwort, and welcome to round 3 of the Crazyhouse World Championship 2020 on Lichess. My opponent is going to be a Norwegian player, well-known player from Fix, who has played Bughouse for a very long time, maybe over 15 years, dieblauesau on Lichess. And it's going to be a best of 10 match of 3+2. Played at 1 p.m. local time in Sydney, which is very early in the morning, European time. Not exactly sure where dieblauesau is playing from, but it will be about 5 a.m. Central European time. So he's already surprised me in game number 1. As you can see, he has a fairly good record against me, 8 games versus 3, but that was spread out over the last couple of years on Lichess. And most of those games have been silly flags where I've been chasing the king, or time scrambles where anything could have happened. So I'm being both quite greedy, keeping the extra pawn on d5, but I think justifiably so, and also fairly cautious with the move d3. So I'm just making sure my bishop is open, preparing against a possible sack on f2, prepared to play king f1 after knight g4 check, and going to find a way to push the knight back. So I'm not too worried about a sack. What else could he do? Bishop g4, I'll just block by putting a pawn on f3, and then that takes the g4 square away from the knight. Castles, I would either think about pawn at h6 or just going knight f3. And if knight g4, I can see two main options, knight h3 with the intention to castle, or another solid move will be knight e4, attacking and defending at the same time. So this is actually the third attempt to record a voice narration, and I've given up on the Movie Maker program because I've tried twice, and after about half an hour the program has crashed. And even though I can save the project, unfortunately it does not save the voice recording. So this is the third attempt. I'm now using the voice recorder program as part of Windows, and we'll see how this goes. See how long it lasts before something crashes. So knight e4, I'm pretty comfortable, half expecting queen h4, but I can always put a pawn on g3 to block. And the only other option seems to be to pull the bishop back, maybe to b6. And then I'm looking at the move pawn at e6. So it's quite a good time for me to play a Crazyhouse match. Saturday afternoon, no work on the weekend. I got up not too early in the morning, but I've been up for a few hours and just gone out to get a coffee. Heart's still pumping, ready for the match. So one thing I certainly don't want to be is asleep. I don't mind if my heart's pumping a little bit faster than usual, but I certainly don't want to be asleep for the match, because then I'll start blundering pieces left, right and centre. Yeah, but obviously dieblauesau has dropped the knight on g4, and it should just be 1-0. I have f2 covered, threatening all kinds of stuff like e7 check, so he's blocked out the bishop on c4, and there are lots of ways to continue, like pawn f7 check, pawn f6 is also good, bishop h6 is also good, but the most forcing move is knight at h6 check, followed by knight f7 check. And I'm just having a quick look at rook takes, e takes, bishop takes g4, rook at g8 check. It does seem like it is made in a few moves after the queen trade for rook and then queen at e8 check, so just going to go with this, just double checking and triple checking myself. But yeah, he can't afford to take the queen on g4, so that means he's got to find something. It looks like black is just too far behind in development and in material, so it should be 1-0. And then the real challenge begins, because dieblauesau played me 4 times last weekend in the chess.com marathon, and he won that mini match 3 games to 1. And he crushed me a couple of times playing 1d4. So I've been trying to do a bit of work on d4, and we'll see what happens in the even numbered games, game number 2, 4, 6 and so on, when I'm facing 1d4. But yeah, dieblauesau is fairly predictable in the openings, although he has surprised me with the black pieces. I think it is a good match strategy to surprise your opponent with the black pieces. And you can afford to take a few risks, because if you're solid with white and you win the vast majority of your games with the white pieces, then you put pressure on your opponent by playing risky openings and forcing your opponent to calculate very precise lines when they have the white pieces, because a lot of the players, if they don't know specifically the openings, will be a little bit overcautious with the white pieces. And so this is a psychological ploy. If you play very sharp openings with the black pieces, like Jasugi is an expert at doing this with his d5 and e6 gabbets in the opening. So this is one line I've been preparing against d4, avoiding d5, which is, well, I'm not sure. I haven't played it before. Setting up a shell-like structure with bishop at g6 as an option. But this allows a sack on f7, so I haven't actually looked at the sack on f7. It took me a little while to work out the point of this move, but I would assume it's to bring the queen to g6 after knight at g5 check, king f8. And then I really don't want to play king f8 in this position, because then after knight at f7, he's winning a heavy piece back, and then you also have a huge weakness on g6 and f7. So without allowing this, the other option is to take him head on with this h takes g and knight at g5 check, king f8, queen takes g6, because I do have a good x-ray defense in bishop at h5, so that's what I noticed. And this defense is much better than playing a move like queen e7, because it allows a sneaky move like bishop at d8, diverting the queen away from the checkmate square on f7. So this seems to force the queen back to d3, and black is very comfortable. So a piece up for a pawn. I could either choose to defend further with pawn at f7, which seems like the most reliable move, or a bit more flexible to develop with knight c6. So I'm leaning towards knight c6. I think it's probably a waste dropping pieces too early, like pawn at b2 doesn't go anywhere, knight at f4, queen d2 also just leaves a piece hanging. I should try to keep the queen on d8 in line with the knight on g5, because there could be some potential discovered attack at some point in the future. But I think knight c6 would be one of the best moves, most flexible, and pawn at f7 the other option. So now, what's coming next? Well, you see white's pieces on f1 and h1, they're going to take a long time to be effective. So actually white has very little that he's working with. I feel like he has to knock the bishop away from h5 or trade the bishop somehow, because that's black's best defensive piece. So if he can do a few things like trade the bishop or push away the bishop and also trade a knight on c6, or find some other way to trade a knight, then there are potential weak squares on g6 and f7 to take advantage of. But apart from that, there's not a lot going on immediately for white. So bishop at f3 seems like an attempt to do all of the above. And not really sure. If I trade the bishop, just sort of helps him open up his bishop on f1. Didn't want to do that. I even thought about pulling the bishop all the way back to e8, but then it's a bit too passive. There's no need. Pawn at g4 is an option. But pawn at f7 seems like a reasonable defense. Intending to take back on h5, which would have been a good move. But unfortunately, I tricked myself by thinking too much. And then I took away the pre-move. Because I was calculating knight takes f7, king takes f7, bishop at g6 check, king moves somewhere like e7, bishop takes h5. And I got scared of the threaded rook at f7 check. Even though it was perfectly fine to just go knight takes h5, he's only got a rook and a couple of pawns in hand. There's no real danger. So I should have gone for that and just taken all the material and defended. But I kind of tricked myself because I thought, I'm looking at the time as well. I'm 40 seconds up on the clock. I just play an instant move knight f4. But he doesn't have to move the queen. He can counterattack. So this is already a serious mistake, knight at f4, because it's allowing knight takes f7, which he wants to do anyway. And it turns out knight takes d3 at the moment effectively only gives him one more piece to attack with, because white is the one that's attacking. I have no follow-up after knight takes queen. So I thought the best option here was not to take the queen, but to get rid of the pieces in my half of the board, which are the bishop and the knight. So that's the decision I made. I still think black is doing reasonably okay after knight takes d8. I have all the squares covered surrounding the king, so using the knights to defend is generally not very advisable because your knights are not the best defensive pieces. But it turns out they work well here, coordinating with each other. I could possibly play knight takes g6 and bishop at f7. I still don't want to take the queen on d3. Maybe now it is a chance, and then I can try to counterattack via bishop at b2. But yeah, rook h6 is not the best move because it's just giving him everything that he wants. He wants to use whatever he has in hand. And he's playing very, very resourcefully here and dropping pawns on h7 and f7. So it means that I'm the one who always has to calculate every single move. Is there a forced mate with queen at g8 or queen at h8? If he picks up a knight, there's ideas like pawn at e7 and knight at g8 to watch for. I'm not sure whether I should take the queen or the bishop. There's a lot to calculate. And in the end, I decided to play a safety first move and drop the knight in the corner. So forming a tripod sort of formation with the four knights, over protecting f7 and g6. But after his response, pawn at f7, yeah, it is getting very scary. I probably should have, yeah, I really don't know. Maybe taken the pawn, knight d takes f7. Does that work? Taking the bishop back. At least there's no queen at g8 or queen at e8 to watch for. So 3, 2, 1. Take the bishop. Maybe not the best move, but at least there's no promotion on f8. So if he sacks the queen on g6, I do have knight takes g6 in response. So my main aim is to stop all the pawns promoting on my back rank. It's very scary to defend, but I still feel like at the moment black is doing okay. Block out the queen. He's coming back. I should take the pawn. I need to get rid of the pawns. I should not be taking the queen and just allowing him a free promotion. Trying to stop the f-pawn from promoting at least. He sacked the fake queen. Knight at g4, maybe a slip. Knight takes... Oh, he should just pick up the free piece on g6, but it's getting very messy. The rest of the game's going to be with 2 seconds each. That's a terrible mistake. I should drop the pawn on e6, not play bishop e6. So I just gave away a free piece. I should probably just take everything on d5 and then attack the queen, but I just gave up 2 bishops in a row for free. I need to save the rook. That's 3 pieces in a row for free. I'm giving away 4 pieces for the queen. I already had a queen in hand. It's not doing anything. So I've effectively just given him 4 pieces for free. When I was the one with the material advantage, there was no need to do any of this. But yeah, you can see what I mean about the time scramble in the introduction to the match. A lot of our games do end this way. We're trying to find ways to defend, attack, and pick up material and defend material at the same time. Unfortunately, I'm not doing a very good job of the 4th important feature in a time scramble, which is defending your material. I've defended the mates. We don't have a forced mate, neither of us. But unfortunately, I've just dropped about 4 pieces. Well, that's now 5 pieces for free. Rook d1 saves everything. Again, nothing I can do with the 2 queens in hand. Desperate to attack and defend at the same time. I'm just relying on cheapos at the moment with pawn at g2. But yeah, there's really nothing going on. There is just rook g1. King d2 is a very good defensive move because it means I have to spend a lot of time finding a way through. I sack the queen, which is going to kill me in the end. So I'm saving both queens, but he always has rook takes d8. He could play it now. There's lots of ways to proceed. He could pick up the bishop at any time. There's no need to play a defensive move, but Nothing wrong with it either. Yeah, one last chance to counter-attack via c3, but I've just given up about 7 pieces in a row, so yeah, all dieblauesau has to do is to find a forcing sequence of checks here, which he's going to do with bishop at f4 followed by knight takes f7. He has another knight for h8, and pawn at g4 is going to finish me off. And they are real queens, so I have 2 real queens, not promoted fake queens. Yeah, so this move wins a real queen, and he has bishop takes g5, or winning the queen is good enough. So exciting finish to game number 2, but yeah, many opportunities I had to defend better and save the material. Well, it was a bit unfortunate, but 1 game all. The best thing to do in this sort of situation is to just forget about all the mistakes that you made. Keep the result in the back of your mind, because it's always useful to know the result, and if you're heading towards tie breaks, and if you need to push a bit harder, or just having a bit of a joke about the ridiculous time scramble. But let's move on and focus on game number 3. So we have a French defense with an early knight f6. Now I do like this move order because it means you can throw in an early queen g4. And in some lines you can't do this, or it doesn't work so well. So just waiting for the bishop to move and throwing queen g4. Now, of course, in Bughouse, if you have a chance for your partners to take a heavy, you'd go knight takes c3, and then, well, it's not such a good opening for white after all. But in either Bughouse or, of course, in Crazyhouse, it's very good for white if you can follow it with a quick queen takes g7, because the main thing is that it makes a huge hold on f6. So you're going to pick up the knight after knight takes c3, queen takes g7, rook f8, b takes c3. And you can even do a chess move with a3 after rook f8. So a3 is one of those sneaky chess moves which wins a piece back. And the point is, of course, that there is no good discovered check after a3. So the knight is too far away to reach the queen on g7. But I decided to just not be fancy and pick up the knight, because it's, of course, very useful on f6. So he's going to check, I'll block with the pawn. And then the obvious threat is knight at f6. Now, if he ever takes on a1, it is very slow, because he has to take the rook, put it back on the board, and then take on c1, which takes 3 turns. And something real bad going to happen in that time. So he decided to go knight at h5 instead to defend. And there are many good options here. I could sack the queen on f8 and take the bishop on c3. And the idea is that a bishop plus a rook plus lots of holes on the dark squares is certainly sufficient compensation for a queen. Well, more than enough compensation for the queen. I could go queen takes h7, and then the idea is to clean up the knight before dropping on f6. Also, other ideas of playing pawn at g7. And what I did in the game was a way to push the pawn on e5 forwards by trading and then taking back with the pawn. So knight at f6 check, knight takes, pawn takes. And this does many things favoring white's attack, because if I can ever pick up a pawn for e7, obviously that's very powerful. Other ideas to sack on f8, and the pawn, of course, guards all the escape squares, so that makes rook at h8 check more powerful. And there's also other ideas like bishop a3 check, and it looks like he has to block with a knight, and that means there is only a heavy piece to block the 8th rank with after rook at h8 check. So you'll see what I mean in a moment. Bishop a3 check. He can't step across because there'll be a rook check, and it should be mate to follow. So it looks like the only move to survive is knight at d6, but it's only short-term survival, because the rook at h8 should mate in 5 or 6 moves after trading everything, sticking a knight on h6, and so on. So I feel like it should be 1-0. Just taking a sip of coffee, feeling fairly confident about this game at least, and I'm more looking forward towards the next black game, because I'm still deciding whether to repeat the same opening, inviting a knight sack on f7, And I did feel like the opening went fairly well for black in game number 2. But yeah, really messed up in giving way too much material back when I should have been trying to keep it all and defend. And not allow the pawns to overrun me on h7 and f7. So taking first just gives me even more of a stock of pieces before I trade rooks. And it should be mate to follow with knight takes f7 check and pulling the knight back to h6. So he's going to resign game number 3. Let's move on. So I have a slight lead 2-1, but it's not significant if I'm not winning with the black pieces. Here we go, knight f6. Thinking about e6 again, but decided to try something different with d5. I'm expecting him to play bishop g5, either before or after knight c3. So bishop g7, knight c6 before castling, because if bishop d3 I can try to hunt it down via knight b4. But I've never seen 7 bishop b5. And if you do face a new move in the opening, you should be very cautious before you just rush into force sequences of tactics, because of course everything is different even with one slight variation. It means he can trade on c6. After knight e5 the pawn's already going to be hanging on c6. And then I have to think, do I need to save the queen? There are some times where you can just leave the queen on d8 if you have a strong counterattack prepared. But my opponent's going to come up with another new move here, which is 9, knight g5. So this move, knight g5, is really going to make me think I could be greedy, accept the sacrifice and pull the knight back to h7. But I don't have a lot of defenders on the diagonal. Like he might, I don't know, pull the bishop back to d3 with check. He could even trade and try and overrun me with the 2 knights. Throw the pawn away up to g6 and then knight at g5. Check at some point. So I'm talking about the rook sack on h7. If I don't have time to put the rook back on h1, I thought it was a bit scary. A move I should have considered was bishop f5. That would have been a good move to stop white's next, because I completely missed the move queen d3. Obviously setting up a mate in 1 on h7, but bishop f5 would have been a good way to prevent this. And just say, okay, well, I'm not opening up the h file or taking your knight or allowing you anything. So, right, so I'm going to consider every single legal move to stop checkmate. So f5 I rule out because it just weakens g6 too much, and it means he doesn't need many pieces to checkmate. Rook e8 is a bit ridiculous because of queen h7 and then bishop takes c6, and he doesn't need many pieces to continue the attack. Knight takes f7 looks good for white as well. So what else does that leave? I even briefly considered knight f6, just admitting my mistake and coming back. Not sure about this one, but there is another option that I have with taking on g5. And the key move here is coming next. I need to block up the h file with knight at h3. And it seems a bit outrageous at first, but if he does take, there is a point that the bishop on c8 is guarding the pawn on h3. And he is severely weakening the squares on g2, where I can drop a pawn, and f3, which I can potentially drop a knight if he ever develops a 1 on b1 or places the new knight on the board. So I was feeling okay after knight at h3. He's only got a pawn in hand, and I would really like the bishop on b5 or to trade the 1 on g3, because bishop at e4 is very powerful, or even bishop at f5. So my bishop on c8 really wants to be on f5, and this explains the next move, knight b4, which is okay. There was even a sharper option to pull the knight back to f4 to try to take advantage of the weakness on g2. And even sacking the knight on d4, followed by a move like pawn at e4, or possibly knight 3 f4 as well. So there were some sharper options in knight b4. Knight b4 is, I don't know, more of a chess move, I suppose. He's trying for bishop f5 next. So bishop f5 is the immediate response upon queen d1. But the move queen d2 makes me think Maybe there's some way to sack a piece and go for the initiative, pick up a pawn for f3, for instance. But the safest move is c5. So I didn't think bishop f5 was going anywhere. After queen takes b4, bishop takes c2, knight c3. The bishop is kind of misplaced on c2. So I think c5 is good. I'm trying to open the diagonal for the bishop on g7 to reach all the way down on b2. And his next move is going to be pawn at h6. So here the move bishop h8 is obvious, but I have to be careful I don't smother myself completely and allow some trick based on h7 check. There are other options. Maybe c takes d4 or bishop f5. I thought it was just giving him a bit too much material to set up mating nets with bishop, knight, rook and so on. So I'm going to decide to pull the bishop back to h8 and then try to starve him of material, because I didn't really think he could get away with taking on h3, especially when the bishop is not guarding h2, because there are too many pawns that will overrun him on the second rank in that case. So it's an interesting move that dieblauesau played next, which is clearing the way for castling queenside. The move is knight c3, and I'm pretty much anticipating playing bishop f5 upon any move. So looking at bishop f5 coming next. Obviously if bishop d3, I'd either take it or find some other way. Well, it's not that easy to block the diagonal. Probably just take it and put the bishop somewhere like g6. Alright, so castle queenside is about to get very sharp, very scary for both of us. So I could take on c2, but it's a bit slow to follow up. I thought the most aggressive move here was queen a5. Threatening knight takes a2. If king b1, then I can think about which piece to take on c2. But a3, alright, here we go. Knight takes c2, I think is good. Knight takes d5 to follow. And you can see me hovering around the knight on c2. And my first instinct was to play knight takes d4. And I thought, oh no, my queen's hanging, but I just didn't realize I was threatening a mate on b3 with knight b3. So knight takes d4 was actually the correct move. Trading queens is not so bad, but I really should be putting the queen on to defend against the threat of knight takes e7. I got scared because I also saw h7 check. So this king move is a prophylactic move to stop him playing h7 check. And then that clears the square h6 for the queen to drop. So, oh, it's getting scary. What do I do? Do I take the rook? Do I defend? Do I drop the queen on g6? Do I take on d4, clearing a square? Do I attack? Do I defend? Here we go. He's trying a forcing sequence of checks. I didn't see a mate, mainly because of the bishop on g6 defending me. But he's going to pick that bishop up with check. So I think white is winning if he's careful. I saw the bishop can block. It doesn't look like white has a forced mate. But at the very least, he should be picking up the knight on d4. So e takes d4 is the correct move. The pawn check doesn't really help that much. It more helps me in defense. But he said after the game that queen e4 was a slip. I'm not sure what he intended, but it does hand the initiative over to black. So he had a chance to pick up the knight on d4, but now it is a forced mate. Rook takes queen at c1 check, and so on. So it's unfortunate for dieblauesau because he definitely should have held on with e takes d4. Alright, so I got away with that one. It's the first win with the black pieces. 3 games to 1. And here we go, game number 4. Alright, sticking to my trusty e4 until he refutes one e4. I'm expecting him to mix it up a little bit. Maybe knight f6, maybe d5. Alright, same thing again. I'm going to try to vary the move order a little. Maybe knight f3 in case of knight f6. Or thinking about knight f3 now. I mean, normally moving the bishop is good because you want to clear the square f1 in case he ever sacks on f2. But nothing wrong with playing knight f3 here. You just don't want to allow the knight g4 check when the king has to go back to e1, because then pawn at f2, king e2 blocks out all your pieces on the first rank. So expecting knight f6 and for him to sack another pawn on e5. Queen e7 is another option. But yeah, a bit surprised by bishop g4 because normally black likes to clear that square for the knight from g8 coming down to f6. I guess he thought, well, his strategy in game number 1 didn't work very well, so he's trying something different, which also makes sense. It's very unlikely that your opponent, with already a surprise on move 2, is going to have anything prepared. So it's just a matter of relying on your experience and trying to stay solid with the white pieces, keep the extra material, and only trying to trade pieces in your favor when you have repelled all the attacks. I'm not 100% sure about this move, knight e4. The idea was, as I'm pointing with the mouse, that the queen has moved away from the pawn on d5, so I don't need to protect the pawn at the moment. But the other thing is that the move itself doesn't really contain any threats, and that's why he's just developing sensibly, which he should be doing. So yeah, make a little weakness on g7, even though it could potentially favor black after rook g8. I was thinking about dropping the knight, but then I noticed knight at f4 is black's main threat. So I think I should be doing something to stop knight at f4. Pawn at e3 just looked a little bit too passive, although it's probably a reasonable sort of a move. He should probably push e4 in that case. And then knight at h4 ideas coming. Sometimes in this sort of position you can play d4. And then, yeah, sort of sack a pawn. Still didn't really see a follow-up. So d3 looks like the safest move to cover f4. I thought he might drop the knight anyway and then try for something, ramming something down my throat on e3. Like bishop at e3 to follow after the trade on f4. So, okay, once the knight reaches e4, at least he can't open the e-file very easily. But again, I'm not really threatening anything. The idea was to play pawn at g5, so that's why I'm using the mouse to pretend to drop the pawn on g5. So black's biggest weakness is the pawn on f6. Because the idea is to drop a pawn on g5 and then knight f6. And this is white's main attacking idea. Could potentially trade on c5, but I don't really see the point at the moment because it just leaves the pawn on d5 hanging. So, alright, knight takes g2 the main threat, but also ideas of luring the queen out to f3 and then dropping with tempo on the queen. So this pawn at g5 does block out the rook, it does make some sense. And I thought the sharpest move here was knight takes f3 check, followed by some way to harass the queen, maybe knight at d4. And then I have to calculate very precisely if knight takes f6 check is worthwhile, or should I just be bringing the queen back to d1 to defend and allow bishop at e2? And then queen takes e2, knight takes e2, knight takes f6 check. It is a bit scary. Or do I take on f6 first with check? It's something that we both have to calculate. But it is a pressure game because usually when you lose a game with the white pieces, you have to hit back quickly. I mean, just like a real World Championship match. Karjakin versus Carlsen or Anand versus Carlsen. So there's a lot of pressure when you lose a big game, especially with the white pieces. Okay, bishop at g4, trying to be very solid, but I actually didn't see the response. f5 is a very good move. And I already thought, well, I don't know if I'm better or worse or equal or unclear. I don't mind losing a piece so much if there's a good way to build up an attack using a pawn at e6, pawn at c6, pawn at f6. I actually do want to leave a hole on f6 for a knight because I didn't think a pawn would be much use on f6. So even thinking about sacking a pawn via knight f6 check, but decided to go knight takes c5, expecting either knight takes or even a sharp move pawn takes g4, which might have been black's best option. But okay, bishop e3, trying to build up a wall with the bishops, using the 4 bishops. And I didn't mind losing a piece, as I said before. As long as I have all the light squares defended very well, yeah, I don't mind playing a move like bishop at h3. Even though there may be objectively better moves, like, I don't know, bishop at c6 or bishop at b5. But if I can try and line up 2 bishops on the diagonal, the idea is to try to prevent castling queenside. So the king is stuck on the center. There's an immediate threat to take on d7. I can trade a knight, put it back on f6. But this is maybe a little too desperate with queen b4 check. But I think white was taking over the initiative in any case. So knight at f6 check to follow. There's another idea, pawn at d7 and knight at c8 check. Perhaps he could have sheltered the king on d8. Would have been a bit tougher to break through. Alright, so picking up 2 rooks, it should be enough to mate. In case he counterattacks via something like pawn at e3. Alright, here we go. Looking for a force mate. Rook at d7 check. King f8 is forced. Rook takes f7, maybe not enough, so rook d8 check I think is good. And it seems like he has to block. Sack the rook, use the bishop that's on the board. There's no need to triple up the bishops. And I probably should have dropped the rook immediately because the bishop drop check is then very strong. For example, even bishop at h8 looks like a mate with rook g8 to follow. So this is a little bit slower way to do it. But yeah, bishop f8 there is a key move because it forces the king to a white square. And then it's either c4 and fe3 to finish, or bishop he6 also works, because I have bishop takes to follow, and the key move in that case is queen b3 check. So trying to lure the queen on b6 out of the way, and then eventually queen b3 check. And it should have been made in another 3, 4, 5 moves, something like that, depending on how much I messed around. But I don't think I ever lost the force mating sequence. Right, so scoreline is currently 4-1. We are repeating game number 2, which, as I said, felt like it went fairly well for black. I did have this position exactly in the preparation before the match. Was expecting just a developing move like bishop e2 or putting a bishop on the board somewhere. So I haven't looked at rook b1. I'm out of book on move number 8. Move number 9 after rook b1 rather. So options to castle, bishop at g6 perhaps. Bishop at a6 is interesting because the main idea is if the queen moves I will take on f1, and that means that white cannot castle for the rest of the game. And then I still have a bishop in hand and I can decide what to do with it. Bishop at g6 is the most solid approach. But with the queen on f3 I can gain a tempo with bishop at h5. And as we saw in game number 2, the bishop is actually very well placed on h5 in defense and attack. And it takes a couple of moves for white to drop a piece to exchange it. So castling is okay. h6 was my original idea, but then I noticed that knight g4 is very strong because it unleashes an attack on g5 with the queen. It means that the white queen has to keep an eye on the knight on g5, but there's also a loose pawn on h2. And I'm looking ahead, queen d2, knight takes h2, if rook h1. No, I don't have to move the knight out of the way. There is a winning tactic for black, and it's based on the 2 knights coming to f3 with a fork. So the winning move in that case is queen takes g5. So only a temporary queen sack, winning the queen back with knight at f3 check. And with the material advantage and the holes everywhere around f3, e2, g2, it should certainly be enough to win. So yeah, queen anywhere, maybe queen f4, but then I had the idea to play e5. Looks like I'm pushing the queen back in any case. Opening the d file definitely is into black's advantage because I'm taking away the square d2. Yeah, so really white is out of options. Knight h2 prepared already, rook h1's coming, and queen takes g5. The mouse is already hovering over the queen, in anticipation. Trying to consider what else white can do if not rook h1. But here we go, instant response. And yeah, I mean, there are so many ideas. There's queen takes g2, knight at f3 check, queen takes d2. It's just too much for white to cover. So there we go. Now, to be honest, you cannot say that is specific preparation that won the game. I would say, however, that considering the first 8 moves is preparation, that it gained a time advantage. And it also gave me the confidence to realize that black is doing okay. So I hadn't looked at the move 9 rook b1, but I had some basic understanding of what to do. I know that black is meant to be okay, and I just work out the rest during the game. So yeah, you don't necessarily need to calculate or remember long sequences of 20 moves or longer. As long as you're doing okay after 8 or 10 moves, that's the main thing, especially with the black pieces. Alright, so of course knight takes g5 is possible, but much better to drop the pawn on e2 first. And that way the pawn is potentially useful for checks on the back row and making a queen, or even just simply lowering the king up to g2, and then I have ideas to check on f3. So it looks like g2 is the key square that he has to cover, which he's doing with the knights, but yeah, it is too much to hold this position. So pawn at h3 check is okay. Pawn at f3, probably not the best move because it's just king g1. And I had another idea during the game to play e5 and activate the bishop on c8. So that seems to make pawn at h3 even stronger. And just again putting the pressure on white how to defend. Don't mind trading the bishop because then there are other options to stick it on d5 or e4. And in the game he's going to come back with the king to g1. Was looking at pawn at g2 stuff like that, but then I noticed that there's a cute smothered mate with queen at g2, knight f3. Using the pieces on the board as well as the pieces off the board. So scoreline is 5-1. So yeah, very, very happy with that game from start to finish. It's probably been my best game so far, game number 6. Alright, so do or die for dieblauesau. He's got to come up with something with the black pieces because it's been too comfortable so far, although the previous white game, game number 5, I felt like he did have some chances, especially after the move f5, and then I had to sack a piece, and it was a little bit unclear. But okay, we have played this position a couple of times already. Pawn at e4, bishop b5, threatening mate in 1, so he has to defend the square e7 or take the bishop. So simply trying to distract the knight away from the key square e7. He can go king takes bishop. I get rid of the knight, stick the bishop on h4 check. So he can block with the bishop. Now the main idea is to take it once and then stick the bishop back on d6, because then there are 2 targets, of course, as you can see, c7 and e7, and it is impossible to find a good way for black to cover them both. The more important piece to cover is actually the pawn on c7, but I'm still prepared to sack the bishop and then drop the pawn immediately back on d6. So from the other perspective in defense, the key square to cover is e2, so stopping the mate with knight at e2 check, king h1, and smothered mate, queen at g1 check. So as long as I have e2 covered, the knight is not going to checkmate me. He needs 2 knights for h3 and f3 to go anywhere. But yeah, just bishops in hand is not enough, so black will need either a rook or a knight to mate. The queen drop on g3 is the most accurate because it covers the pawn on d6. And there is really nothing he can do with 2 bishops in hand. The queen trade goes nowhere. So I was expecting something like knight c6, queen takes g6, h takes g6, and then I saw there was a clever way to finish with queen at e7, knight takes, and pawn at c7 checkmate. Probably the longest way to survive is something like bishop d7, and it just means that you can't go, queen takes c7, then queen e7 to mate, and you're blocking out the bishop on b5. But still, there should be lots of good moves after bishop d7. Can trade queens anytime, and drop the queen on c7, or drop a pawn on c7, take the bishop with check. You can pretty much do everything with check after that. So, yeah, this is fairly well known. He has repeated a line which we played very recently, so that explains the time advantage. I'm very comfortable with the white pieces here. And we'll see if he has any last tricks. Otherwise, this game is going to be the deciding game of the match. Yeah, so in Bughouse you'd have to have a time advantage and a favourable position on the other board where you could trade lots of pieces. But yeah, Crazyhouse, this is always going to be 1-0 because black simply cannot trade the pieces that he needs in time. And yeah, the pawn on d6 is just too powerful. So looks like this is going to be it. Resigns. Alright, GG's dieblauesau. 6-1 is the official scoreline, and this was a round 3 match, which means that Mugwort continues on to round 4, and we'll play the winner of the Master 10 versus Phantom Troop match, which I think is yet to be decided. The date is yet to be decided, but I will be following that one closely. So Master 10, a very well-known player from Australia, and do not look at his rating. He's much stronger than his current rating, which is about 2400. But I think he has even reached 3,000 rating a few years ago. Maybe hasn't been so active in the last 6 months or so. But Master 10 has reached just about every candidates there has ever been in the Crazyhouse World Championship. So a dark horse always to watch out for. Very dangerous player, very creative player as well. He likes to throw in, a bit like Schwanet, some random openings. I'm not saying he doesn't know openings, but he likes to surprise the opponent and make up openings on the spot and just play a position, which is, of course, a perfectly viable way to play Crazyhouse. Looking forward to the match, no matter who wins, Master 10 or Phantom Troop, and that will be sometime in the next 3 weeks, I would imagine. I will probably be practicing not any specific opening, but some random openings in preparation for the match, and maybe trying to play some faster games. Master 10 also a very good bullet player, 30-second and 1-minute player. So again, I could say that 99.9% of players are much faster than myself. I'm not a speed player at all, but was lucky in a couple of these games to finish with more than 3 minutes on the clock, only due to the familiar openings. And right, so thanks to everybody for joining in the post-match commentary. This has been Mugwort in round 3 of the World Crazyhouse Championships. Looking forward to commentating on more matches in round 3. I will post the knockout draw and also the upcoming schedule of the calendar in the description below. So have a good weekend. If you're watching on the weekend, this is still Saturday afternoon Sydney time. And hopefully, third time lucky, this recording is going to work. And I'll be uploading very soon. Take care, everyone, and see you soon.